Hello, Bad Book Club friends, and welcome back to your favorite book podcast. At least I hope so. I hope that everyone is doing great today, and we are here to talk about Slaughterhouse 5. I'm excited to talk about this book. I've never read it before, but I counted it as science fiction and adventure, and you will see why as I tell you about this book. It won a Hugo, which is like an award for science fiction books, so it's considered to be science fiction. And the reason why it is because it involves a man named Billy Pilgrim who describes his experience after the bombing of Dresden in World War II and his prisoner of war experience, but he also describes how he got abducted by aliens. And that is the story. It's very strange. It is a very short book. It's known for its dark humor. And it was my first time reading it, and I have a lot of thoughts about it. The first chapter is actually not part of the story. It is a nonfiction chapter written by the author, Kurt Vonnegut, and he talks about his own experience with Dresden, because he was there for the bombing and he was a prisoner of war. So this is like kind of autobiographical, but clearly not because it's science fiction, or at least I hope not. But he does talk about how he's been working on a book about the war for the long time, and this is what he wrote. So chapter 1 is almost like a prologue, but it does keep things going throughout the book. So you have to read chapter 1, I think, because it sets up a lot of what's to come and it kind of prepares you for it. Now, the other thing about this book is that it is a postmodern book. And I'm going to explain more about that later, but essentially what really matters is that this is a very fragmented piece of work. By that I mean that a big part of it is that Billy, the main character, just jostles through time the whole time. It's very fragmented. It's like pieces of memory. It is, it does have a flow, and I'll explain how he does that. But it's very fragmented. I didn't know quite how I was going to do this podcast because I didn't know how fragmented it was until I read it. And then I was like, well, it's my job to tell the people on Bad Book Club about the summary of the book. And the summary is kind of difficult because it jumps around. And a lot of the summaries that I was finding online did his life in chronological order, and then they talked about, like what times he mentioned these. But I think that you kind of miss out on the book if you look at it that way, because that's not how it's written. But I honestly just don't have time to tell you every little section because it's like paragraph to paragraph, he jumps through time. And so I'm just going to cover the broad terms of it, and then we're just going to get really deep in analysis because I had a really good time analyzing this book. So good, in fact, that this episode's a little later than it should be because I got so caught up in analyzing it and like looking into it and trying to understand it that I lost track of time. So I had the best time with it. I do have some thoughts about it, but I'm going to save them for the end. So how about we get started on summary? All right. Okay, so summary-wise, like I said, chapter 1 talks about his own nonfiction experience with being a prisoner of war in World War II and the bombing of Dresden. Now, from what I can tell when I looked into this is true. Kurt Vonnegut did experience this. And what else is true is that I believe he was accused of being a traitor for even bringing up this concept. And at the time this book was written, it was completely like unpatriotic to talk about how lame war was. Basically, everyone had been kind of like thinking of this war as kind of like a glorious thing. And back then, after his experience, he wrote about it and people were like astonished because it was very unpatriotic at the time. It was very disillusioned and people were not into it. Nowadays, we appreciate it, but back then they did not like it. But he doesn't mention that in the chapter 1, but he does mention how he met his wife, how he was a prisoner of war, how he's been working on this book for a long time, how his whole life he said he was working on his famous war book, and he never really got around to it. He didn't know how to approach it. He talks about how he flew to meet his old war buddy in a different different area, state, I think, and talked to him about how and his wife about how this book would not glorify war in any way, and he would call it the Children's Crusade. He didn't. He called it Slaughterhouse 5, which is the name of the actual place that Vonnegut was kept as a prisoner of war in Dresden. So that is true. And he writes himself into this book as a narrator, as a character later on. So we'll talk more about that soon. But chapter 1 is just about that, about how he's been writing this book for a long time. And he tells us that it starts with Billy has come unstuck in time. And it ends with po-tu-tweet, which is supposed to be like a bird, but I'm really bad at saying it out loud, so I'm really sorry you just had to hear that. But so that's how the book starts and ends, and then he actually starts the book. Chapter 2 of it is all about how Billy Pilgrim was born in Ilium, New York, and then he goes on, and I'm going to try and keep this the way the book writes it, okay? So I will be hopping around, and I'll try to keep it as pertinent as possible, but it might take me a second. I'm going to have to flip through some pages, but it's okay. But we're going to get this done the way the book tells it, not the way his life is ordered. And we can just go over it briefly at the end in case you get confused, but this is how the book is written. It talks about how he was born, and then he talks about how he was assigned as a chaplain's assistant in South Carolina, and then his father died after accidentally being shot by a friend while hunting. Billy says how he joined an infantry regiment fighting in Luxembourg, and after the regiment was decimated by the German army during the Battle of the Bulge, which I believe was supposed to be like his first or second day on the job. Like he just got to Luxembourg after his father's funeral. And at the Battle of the Bulge, his regiment was destroyed. He did not even have army issued stuff yet. Like he did not have boots. He did not have a weapon. Like he was wearing the clothes, like his civilian clothes that he had been assigned before he had even got there. So that's how new he was to the situation. He and 3 other people, including a man named Roland Weary, which is a name, find themselves behind the German lines. Billy and Weary and these 3 men just kind of walk around and spend 3 days wandering, trying to find their way home, and then they're captured by the Germans. Now, the important thing to know about this is that we learn a lot of detail about Roland Weary and how he is kind of a bully. He's 18. He's younger than Billy, technically, and he's 18, and he is crazy almost. He's a little bit crazy. He wears all of his clothes all at one time, and he is obsessed with all these things. He's kind of a big bully, and he's kind of forcing Billy to join them because Billy is despondent. He's you guys go on without me. It's fine. And they're no, you will die if we leave you behind. So Roland keeps dragging this sorry man behind him. And you feel really bad for Billy because, like I said, he's really just almost suicidal, and he's losing his mind. Several times it's they ate snow, and he was having hallucinations of a man just standing and dying in the snow and stuff like that. He's clearly losing his mind out here in the snow and with these other people that he's with. And the important bit to know about all of this is that during his time in these woods with his friends is when he first comes unstuck in time. What do I mean by that? Well, let's look into it. Oh, it's so interesting. Okay, so there's also this really interesting passage. Gonna cut that out. Oh, I have to wait. Okay. Okay, so Billy comes up unstuck in time for the very first time. His attention starts to swing through his life, and he goes from his birth to his death. Now, something to keep in mind here is that this book is very ambiguous. By ambiguous, I mean that it is up to the reader to decide whether Billy is losing his mind or whether this is actually happening. So we'll get into that, but he comes unstuck in time. So he swings back into pre-birth, which is apparently red light and full of bubbling sounds. And he swings into death, which is just a purple hum, basically. And he remembers this memory of how his dad taught him how to swim. So they went to the YMCA, and then his dad just dumped him into the deep end to learn how to sink or swim. And then he sunk to the bottom of the pool, and he lost consciousness, and he sensed music. And then his dad rescued him, and Billy resented being rescued. So that's his first time being unstuck in time, quote unquote. And then he travels to 1965, which is way when he's older, and his mom has been put into this old people's home, and he's having a conversation with her, and she whispers to him, "How did I get so old?" because she's having a hard time. And then we're back to not yet. We're going to 1965 or 1958. Gotta cut that. So then we move from 1965 to 1958, and he's at like a little league team for his son. So he's really, really, traveling through time. And then he's at a New Year's Eve party, and he's wasted, and he's hooking up with a woman, even though he's married, and everyone thinks it's really dumb. And then he tries to drive home, but he gets into the back seat and can't find the wheel. And then he's back to regular, like, wartime. So as you can see, we get lots of these tiny moments, little vignettes of Billy's life, and they're all kind of sad. And that's just the way it goes. And Billy, during this, isn't freaking out or anything. He's enjoying being lost in time like this. This is something he thinks is like correct and normal and right. He doesn't think a lot about it. It simply is. That's how it is to Billy. It simply is that way. He comes back to World War II, and WWII and all of these three people, it's three people and then Billy. So it's WWII and two scouts. And they are walking around, and these two scouts decide they're going to ditch Roland and Billy. They're being weird. The scouts have done this before. They're out of here. So they ditch Roland and WWII, and they head off into the wilderness. WWII takes this personally because he thought he and these two other guys are like the Three Musketeers. He has like delusions of grandeur, basically. And he takes it out on Billy. He starts beating the crap out of Billy in the snow, and Billy's laughing like an insane person. And this is when the German troops come upon him, or just like some German guys, basically, with a dog. And they see these two Americans, they're like, why are they fighting? And they capture them, and they become prisoners of war. And in the distance, we hear two gunshots as the scouts are killed by other Germans. So the scouts did this thing. This is where I have to mention something important. Throughout this whole book, anytime death is mentioned, someone dies, something dies, any sort of thing, living or not, dies, or use the word dies, Vonnegut follows it up by saying the phrase, so it goes. So I'm going to mention, in my analysis, I'll talk about that, but that's an important part of the book. He mentions it in the book 106 times. That's how many times he mentions the words, so it goes. So just keep that in mind. Anytime I talk about the scouts dying, he says, so it goes, right after they die. That's how it works. All right, and then we're on to chapter 3. In chapter 3, they are marched into Germany, and the prisoners are loaded into box cars bound for Eastern Germany. Oh, it's really, really sad. There's a train load of American prisoners, and they're all in this like really tiny train, and it begins to creep like eastward after sitting idle for like 2 days. Billy finds his way to like this little like corner vent of the train car, and it's his job to like dump people's like excrement. Sorry, that's really gross. But it's his job to do that, and then these guards give out food occasionally, and I think it's very, very cold, and in one train, like, a man dies and stuff, and it's like really a huge bummer, so it goes. And the German like guards, they have their own little glorious train car with like their own dinner and stuff like that, and Billy's looking at it, and he thinks it seems wonderful. Now, keep in mind, Billy doesn't really have any emotion about being in this train car. Billy, like I said, thinks everything is and isn't really concerned about his location, his behavior, or the activities that are happening around him. He just watches them and accepts them and then moves through time. So that's how Billy works. And anywho, I believe that's most of what happens in chapter 3. Chapter 3 also includes this description of how Billy and everybody would take turns sleeping on the floor of the train car, and they would kind of nestle into each other like spoons, quote unquote. He says this several times, and then he says that after a couple nights, he learned no one wants Billy to sleep by him, and he doesn't know why. And they're like, because you like kick and scream and yell, and no one wants to sleep by you. So no one wants to sleep by Billy. He's confused by this, so he sleeps standing up. It's very strange. So that's very strange. There's also this hobo who says that this isn't anything. Like, I've experienced tons of worse things, like over and over and over again. He also comes unstuck in time again, and he, in the future, in like 1967, he becomes a president of the Lions Club, and he attends a club luncheon where a Marine Corps major comments that he should be proud of his son, Billy's son, Robert, who is now a Green Beret fighting in Vietnam. So yeah. And then that's mostly chapter 3. Oh, something that we learned in chapter 2, right at the beginning, I forgot. He has this little like little monologue right at the beginning that kind of just sums up his whole life. In that monologue, he mentions that his wife dies of carbon monoxide poisoning at some point, and he was in a airplane crash after the war where everyone died but himself. And he just kind of mentions that offhand, so it goes. And then he tells you the rest of the stories. But sorry to backtrack, we're on chapter 3. And that's chapter 3. They finally make their way to the, the German area. So they make their way there. And on the way, Roland Weary, who was loaded into a separate train car, dies of gangrene because the shoes that they had given him mangled his feet, which is really vivid, such a vivid description. Something also to note about this book that I've noticed is that every single sentence basically is very simplistic. This book is written very, very simplistic. There isn't a ton of emotion in it. And because of that, there's a ton of emotion in it. It's almost like if some like dead-eyed person were to describe something to you, and like even though what they're saying has no effect or like tone, it just seems so sad for someone to say sad things in a deadpan way. You know what I mean? Like it's just so sad. So I'm trying to find a little section that can explain it. Let's see. All right, here's one. No, that's not it. Sorry. Oh. Okay, here it is. This is in chapter 2, so right at the beginning. This is like how the book starts. This is our inciting incident. Billy survived, but he was a dazed wanderer far behind the new German lines. 3 other wanderers, not quite so dazed, allowed Billy to tag along. 2 of them were scouts, and 1 was an anti-tank gunner. They were without food or maps. Avoiding Germans, they were delivering themselves into rural silences ever more profound. They ate snow. So that's an example of how simplistic the writing style is and how matter-of-fact it is. But despite it being matter-of-fact, it's actually super depressing. So that's the vibe of this whole book. That's the way he says everything. And it delivers a lot of emotion without really meaning to, because it's so sad. So chapter 4, Roland Weary dies of gangrene, which is really sad. After 10 days of traveling, Billy's train stops at a prison camp originally built as an annihilation camp for Russian prisoners of war, which is prisoners of war. Sorry. Prisoners of war. Billy and his fellow prisoners are cooed from the train. It's this really interesting thing where they say that these like guards have learned that these people like pour like liquid out of these trains, and if they like coo and kind of point them in the right direction, they'll go in the right direction. So these guys are like cooing like owls. They're like, hey, come on this way. And they guide the little prisoners of war from the trains, and they give them jackets, and then they give them like a shower, and then the jackets are like deloused and they're given back to the people, which is really, really interesting. And then in chapter 4, sorry, I have to hop around a little bit. In chapter 4, he remembers, right, okay, so this is the chapter where, first of all, he's given this overcoat where it's really, really tiny, much too small for Billy. Billy is this like weak, spiny creature. He's very pitiful, and the guys kind of give him this jacket as a joke, which is somehow even still too small for him, and has this like fur muff, and it's still civilian clothes. Everyone else has like soldier clothes except for Billy. He still has like civilian clothes on. He's like forced to, which is not good. So, and then in chapter 4, we get to hear about a flying saucer from the planet called Tralfamador that kidnaps Billy on his daughter Barbara, her name is Barbara, wedding night. So it's her wedding night, And they go to bed, and he knows this will happen because Billy is not, having to follow linear time. So he knows this will happen. He knows like to the hour when this will happen. So he wakes up and he goes about his life, and he has a snack, and he watches a movie, but he watches it backwards. And he watches a war movie backwards, where instead of the Americans, some war person bombing another war person, he watches one war person like fly backwards and pick up all of this terrible destruction and then take it away. He watches this like war movie backwards. It's really interesting. And then he takes some time and he goes outside and he waits for the Tralfamadors, I hope I'm saying that right, to come and pick him up. Fun facts about Kurt Vonnegut: his world of books often features similar characters, such as the Tralfamadors. They are also in another book, but they're in this book too. So they pick him up. He's standing outside. They lower this ladder and they kind of mind control him to touch the ladder. And then the ladder pulls him up in this violet light, very classic science fiction. And he's deposited into this little area, and the Tralfamadors make him sit on this yellow Barca lounger. And then they fly him to their home planet, where they kind of put him in this human zoo, he says. And we don't get to see too much more than that, but we do get to see he gets put in a human zoo, which is really, really, really fun, I'm sure. Right, okay. And then we're on to chapter 5. So in chapter 5, we're on to his final year at the Ilium School of Optometry. So Billy's talking about a little later in his life, after the war, after being abducted. I think it's before he's abducted, because it's he's engaged to his future wife. So this is before he's abducted. He's at his final year at the Ilium School of Optometry because his father-in-law kind of put him through that track. And he voluntarily commits himself into a veterans hospital ward for non-violent mental patients. In the hospital, he meets Elliot Rosewater, who introduces him to Kilgore Trout's science fiction novels. The important thing about this is that Kilgore Trout is another person in Vonnegut's world, so you can find stuff about him in his other books, and people love this character. I don't know anything about it. This is my only Vonnegut novel, so I don't know much about him other than that he's included in Vonnegut's other novels, and people love him. And basically, he writes novels that no one else reads, and they're very science fiction based. And this fellow veteran, Elliot Rosewater, is in love with these books. They talk about how after a war, you kind of feel like you've seen it all, and so you look for meaning elsewhere, and science fiction is often the answer. So Elliot Rosewater's obsessed with these science fiction books, and he passes them on to Billy, and Billy kind of becomes also obsessed with them. And the topics of these books are very similar to his future experiences. Saucy, questionable. And then Billy, his wife comes to visit him, his future wife, and she's kind of fatter and bigger, and she likes to eat candy bars. And he said he knew he was losing his mind when he asked this woman to marry him, which I thought was kind of sad. I'm going to be honest, this book is not the most feminist book I've ever read, but I'll extrapolate on that at the end. But in any case, she's still a nice person, and she goes on to talk about the silver that they're going to order after their wedding, and she's just visiting him, and she talks to Elliot, and Elliot's trying to be nice. And so it's a very kind of cute, sad chapter. You feel very sad for Billy and Elliot, and you kind of feel Billy's disillusionment with life, because I felt disillusioned with life when she was like, what silver pattern do we want? Keep in mind, it's going to be there for the rest of our lives. I don't think that hard about silverware, you guys. And I don't know if I'd want someone asking me about silverware if I was in a veterans hospital losing my mind. I think I would think I was losing my mind again if someone made me very, very concerned about silverware patterns. So you very much feel it as a reader in that moment. Oh yeah. Okay, so more chapter 5 information. Let's go on and on. All right. Sorry. Kind of takes me a hot minute to find all of the mess that's going on. Okay, in chapter 5, we also get a flashback. Billy tells us about how when he was very young, his family vacationed at Grand Canyon and he was terrified. I made note of this. This is the first time that Billy is terrified in any situation. Billy is currently a prisoner of war in Dresden or wherever he's a prisoner of war. He's currently a prisoner of war, and this is the first time he is ever experiencing fear or terror, and it is at a beautiful site called the Grand Canyon that people like cry at because it's gorgeous. The same thing happens at Carlsbad Caverns. He like starts to cry because he thinks the walls are gonna like fall in on him. I thought that was really interesting, and I'm going to mention my small analysis here for that moment because it's just too small for me to mention later. But my analysis for that moment is probably that Billy, either two things. I think either Billy is someone who, when he experiences human emotion, does not know what to do and therefore reacts with fear. And so when he experiences like beauty or sees human nature or something like that, he cries. Or number two, possibly both. Since he has this nonlinear version of time, maybe the concepts of these amazing things and seeing them in time, seeing their end and their beginning all at once is overwhelming. So those are the two reasons I think. I think the first one's more likely, but whatever, we'll keep moving on. And that's most of chapter 5, I believe. Okay. Oh, also in chapter 4. I'm so sorry. Like I said, this book is very fragmented. It is very, very fragmented. Let me see. So, let's see. Yeah, in chapter 4, so I'm sorry, backtrack just a little bit. In chapter 4, we also get this scene, and it's important for what's happening at the prisoners of war. So they are ushered into the camp, they're showered, they're given coats, he gets given like a silly coat, and then these like British prisoners of war, who actually have like a good relationship with the German commanders in that area, are like, they set up like this like kind of cute like play, and like little welcoming feast for the Americans because they're like kind of excited. It's like kind of adorable. Basically, the British have been there for like 5 years, and they've just been chilling in this prisoner of war camp, and they have like kind of a good relationship with the German people, and they like talk and hang out, and they have like their extra cabins because of that relationship and like all that jazz, but they're very excited to see the Americans, and so they have a feast set up, and they have like this little play, and they're all sat down to eat the feast and watch the play. And Billy starts laughing at something in the play, and then he starts shrieking because it's so funny, and then he doesn't stop shrieking. So people take him to the prisoner hospital, which is just like connected to the British little area tent, because he's clearly losing his mind. And among that, the British are kind of disappointed by the Americans because there's this whole bit, it's a very critique of American culture and the army and bravery. Basically, these British are like manly men, and all of these like scrawny, sad, demented children are walked in, and they're American. And like the British don't know what to do, and they're kind of sad. And they know too that like the Americans don't really have a sense of like brotherhood. So like the Germans are like sorry that they like imposed the Americans on the British. They're like, I'm so sorry we brought these like scrawny people in here. And the British are like, it's okay, get them their own cabin, because they like kind of don't like the Americans. The Americans are not very nice. They're not like glorified with war. They're not trying to have a good time. They're just depressed. It's very interesting, that little dynamic. And a person goes with Billy to the prisoner hospital. His name is Edgar Derby. Edgar Derby is a very important part of the book. His name is repeated over and over and over again, even in the first chapter, because this is something that actually happened to Vonnegut when he was a prisoner of war. After the bombing of Dresden, a friend of Vonnegut's stole a teapot, and in the midst of that like decimation, he had to watch his friend discovered he had stolen a teapot, and he got put on trial and executed for stealing a teapot. And he talks about the irony of that moment. Like, he lived through a war, he lived through a bombing, and he got executed for stealing a teapot in desolation. Like, it was insane. This is like a true thing that happened to Vonnegut, and Edgar Derby is that person in this book. So his name's changed, obviously, but he's that person. So Billy is sad for this poor man, and he always calls him poor Edgar Derby. He's like 42. He's really old. He entered like so he could hopefully like climb his way up in the ranks. His son is also in the war, and he's kind of this like wise man that the other ones kind of respect. And he's just very sad. Billy's always sad when he looks at him, but he's a pretty nice guy. I think he is the epitome of the type of person that Vonnegut is not criticizing, but maybe pitying. He's the type of person who like believes he's a leader, believes he's wise, and his life is thrown away by war for like no reason. And he believed that war would lead him somewhere good. So I think that pity that Vonnegut has is relayed through Billy in that sense, because he knows this guy's gonna die. But anyway, he sits beside Billy's bedside, and then Billy does all of that flashback in time stuff, and then that's chapter, I believe, 4 and 5 kind of in there. I'm sorry for jumping around, but this book jumps around, y'all. That's how it works. All right, and I believe we were on chapter 5, and I think we finished up chapter 5, so we'll move on to chapter 6. Let's move on to chapter 6. Chapter 6. Okay, in chapter 6, the prisoners are shipped. Oh, by the way, also, it's really sad. In chapter either 5 or 4, all of the Americans actually get sick from the feast that the British people put out for them. And so they all go to like this latrine, which is basically just buckets, and they're all getting sick. And the narrator says, so this is a third person novel. He says Billy Pilgrim is his name. And he talks about Billy, the word Billy, and uses third person. Occasionally the narrator will jump in and say I, because he's the narrator. And so the narrator, in that moment, Billy said that he saw a man who was, like having some digestion problems, and he said, there they go, there they go. And they meant like his brains, because he was like, like he was losing his brains because of the digestion. It's like a very like vivid scene. And the narrator says, and that man was me. I was the man who was like, like having trouble over a bucket. Like that was me. So periodically in the book, the narrator will point himself out for us, and he is with Billy during this time. Billy also comes across this man named Lazarus, and Lazarus, I believe that's his name, says that in the train car with Ronald Weary died of gangrene. Weary said that Lazaro. While Ronald was dying of gangrene, Ronald just like lamented about how the person who killed him was Billy Pilgrim, and said that he had to be avenged. And so Lazaro was also taken to the infirmary because he got his arm broken by one of the British soldiers when he tried to steal his cigarettes. And they carry him in. He's like this scrawny, skinny dude. And he says that Vonnegut says in chapter 1 that he actually knew a man who threatened to do this. He threatens that anyone who harms him during the war, he will hire someone to kill after the war. So he said he'll do that with the guy who broke his arm. And then he tells Billy next to him that he'll do it to Billy. He says, I'll do it to you, and just wait 5, 10, 15 years. I will kill you because you killed my friend, Ronald Weary. So just something to keep in mind. Not great for Billy, but Billy's like, all right, cool, it simply is. That's how it works. So, chapter 6. Like I was saying, chapter 6. Sorry. Chapter 6. Okay. So now the Americans, they wake up. First of all, he has this, he wakes up in the middle of the night but from being unstuck, and he goes to the restroom. It's not that interesting, but he does find a Russian man, and the Russian man's like, are you okay? And helps unstick him from a barbed wire fence. And it's actually like a really cute scene. Let's see if I can find it. I believe I just flipped. I'm not there yet. Sorry. This is going to be a lot of me flipping through pages. The podcast will be cut out, but this video I don't edit. So you can see all my bloopers. This is a blooper. Let's see. I see. Okay. Maybe this isn't worth it. Maybe I should just let it go. It was a really cute scene. It's the only thing. Oh. Sorry. I just realized what chapter this is. 5. Also in chapter 5, sorry, we're jumping around a lot. I will at the end do a chronological order of this. Chapter 5, we also get a flashback to his honeymoon with his wife. Her name is, I should know her name, but I'm forgetting her name. Starts with a V. I want to say Valencia. Goes on a honeymoon with his wife, Valencia, and he describes how they had nightly relations, and how from that nightly relations she got pregnant with their son, and he describes that very clinically, all about like the actual organs. It's very kind of gross. It's a little vivid, but he describes it very vividly, and that's his like night honeymooning with his wife. And then he gets up to pee after being with his wife, and when he turns on the light switch, he is now back in the prisoner of war camp, looking for a place to pee outside, where the Russian man helps him from the barbed wire. That's chapter 5. My bad. Chapter 5 also, in there, he says he was taken in Tralfamadore. He flashes back to his alien abduction again. So he says that he was taken from Tralfamadore from the Earth to Tralfamadore, and in that time he was taken to Tralfamadore and put in this like human zoo. So he was put in this like big igloo looking thing with like furnishings of a human and oxygen and stuff, and they watched him while he did things. They asked him questions. Sometimes he asked questions and they thought he was stupid, because the Tralfamadores see time not linearly, but in like 4 dimensions. So they see time happening all the time. Past, present, future, it's all happening right now. It simply is. You can't change anything about it. There's no such thing as free will. Americans are the only people, or humans, but mostly Americans, are the only people, not personally, I'm not saying personally I think mostly Americans, I'm saying from the book, it's a very American standpoint, so that's why I'm saying American. So they say, humans are the only ones who really have like any sort of free will type of vibe going on. Like, you guys are just crazy. Everyone else knows that that's not true in the rest of the universe. And then they decide they're going to fly in a woman to live with Billy and mate with him so they can watch that process. So they fly this woman named Montana Wildhack. She's an actress, a movie star. They fly her into the dome with him, and she screeches because she just arrived and she got doped up. The last thing she remembered was being on Earth. And now she's here, and he's like, don't be scared. And he says how, in the future, like, she learns to trust him, and they end up, like, mating or whatever, and it was heavenly. So she asks him, like, shyly. So he says it was heavenly. His honeymoon with his wife, he just describes very clinically, just for consideration for later. What else? He also talks about this man named Howard W. Campbell Jr., who abandoned America and became like a Nazi, and he was hung for war crimes. And he talked a lot about what I was saying about American society and how they're not brotherly and how they're mostly children, and how America puts down the poor and makes the poor hate themselves, because America touts this belief that if you're smart enough, you can get rich. And they think getting rich is technically easy, but it's not. And so the American poor hate themselves, and they hate other poor, and the rich like prosper off that because the poor are so busy hating themselves and stuff like that. It's a lot about American society and how this bleeds into the army, and how the infantrymen hate each other and themselves. And that's why they end up so despondent and disillusioned. So he has this whole thing. Oh, goodness. And then he has this whole scene where his daughter, Barbara, comes to his house after his wife's death and finds him, like, writing furiously, crazily, and she puts him in bed, and she's like, what are you doing? And then he after that, he wakes up the next day. He had a wet dream about Montana wild hack, which is kind of gross. Sorry, but that's what happened. And then he wakes up and goes to work. And at work, he tells this little boy that from his adventures on Tralfamadore, because he's an optometrist, that he assures this fatherless boy that his father was very much alive still in the moments the boy would see again and again. And so his mom goes to the office and tells him that Billy's losing his mind. And then we're on to chapter 6, so I'm so sorry. Chapter 5 and 6 are very similar content. A lot of it is Tralfamadore and the prisoners arriving at the camp and being transferred to their new camp. So they got a little mixed up in my brain because they're super similar content-wise. So just keep that in mind. That's basically 5 and 6 is they arrive at the camp, they're there for a night, Billy loses his mind, and then they're transferred to a new camp. And in that time, we learn all about Tralfamadore and Montana wild hack, and a little about his past with his father and stuff like that. 5 and 6, in my opinion, are the key to the novel. And I'll talk about that later. So, chapter 6, Lazaro threatens him, all that jazz. They sleep for the night. In chapter 6 also, they elect a person to be the leader of the American group, and they elect Edgar Derby, poor Edgar Derby. And then, like I said, they are transferred to a new prisoner of war camp in Dresden. So they ride these little trains, and the trains are covered with these black and orange stripes. And excuse me, these black and orange stripes denote that this train is holding prisoners of war, and therefore they shouldn't be bombed. You might be bombing your own people. So that's really interesting. And they move through all of these town. They're moving really slowly. He talks about Tralfamadore again. They talk about all that jazz, and then they arrive at the city of Dresden, and it's amazing and beautiful, and it's just kind of a normal town. It hasn't really been affected by the war, except that they're really only eating potatoes because that's all the food they have right now. But otherwise, people work, they go to their lives, they hide whenever they hear sirens, but no one's ever dropped bombs on Dresden because it doesn't have anything to do with manufacturing. They make syrup for pregnant women, and they are just innocents. No one is there to do anything bad. So there's no reason to bomb the city, really. So someone even tells Billy that he doesn't have to worry about being bombed because Dresden's kind of a safe area. It's kind of agreed that no one would bomb Dresden. Ha ha ha. Really funny, you guys, right? Also, he's dressed like a crazy man. Billy's losing his mind, clearly. He's in this weird coat with the muff, and he wrapped himself in these curtains that they were using for the play, like a toga, and he's wearing these shining silver boots that's also from the play. And someone on the streets of Dresden kind of gets offended, and he's like, "Do you think you're funny?" And Billy does not understand what this man's upset about. He's smiling because he's losing his mind, and he finds these 2 things in his pocket, and he holds them out to the man. And one of them is a diamond, and one of them is a denture. And that diamond will later be used in Valencia's engagement ring, which is interesting. And then they are moved to this area called the Slaughterhouses, and they're moved to Slaughterhouse 5. They pronounce it Schlachthof Fünf. So I'm not German. I'm really sorry for that pronunciation, but that's how they pronounce it. And it's called Slaughterhouse 5. That is the name of the place that Vonnegut stayed in as well. It was called Slaughterhouse 5. And it is where they used to store pigs before they got slaughtered. So that's a really fun image. And then we're on chapter 7. So on chapter 7, it starts with Billy Pilgrim being unstuck in time, and he is on a plane with his father-in-law to go to an optometrist convention. And he knows they're about to crash because he knows everything because time. And they crash after listening to some Polish songs, and everyone dies but Billy and the co-pilot. And these skiers find them and kind of zoom them down the mountain. And Billy gets confused because they look kind of German. They're speaking German, and he thinks he's in World War II again. And he whispers Schlachthof 5 to give him his address, which is Slaughterhouse 5, which is very sad. He figured that this was a new part of World War II because he's all loopy because he fractured his skull from this airplane crash. And it says that World War II, this new phase, was all right with him. Everything was pretty much all right with Billy, which I think is the exact opposite. Everything is not all right with Billy. Billy's having a rough time, he is. And in the Edgar Derby house, back to Prisoner of War, they talk about how, like the city, occasionally needs to hide from bombs, but they never really happen. And that's what happened the first night. And the guards waiting for them kind of were, like really young and small and scared of these like men who were arriving from America. But then the men from arriving from America were also small and scared. So they're like, oh, never mind. He walks with one of the guards to find food, and they accidentally open up a shed full of women who are showering. They're also prisoners of war, which is pretty sad. And then it talks about how what they did in the city is they worked. They were laborers. And what they did was they worked at a syrup factory, and the syrup was full of vitamins and minerals for pregnant women. And everyone at the factory snuck spoonfuls of syrup because they needed vitamins and minerals, and they all had like sores and sad things on them because they weren't getting enough vitamins and minerals. It describes how his first time he took a spoon, it was his second day, and he tried it, and it was amazing. And his friend Edgar Derby was right nearby, and so he handed him a spoon, and when he had some syrup, he cried, which is super sad. And then in chapter 8, we get this description of how they got this visitor, and it was Howard W. Campbell Jr. at the Slaughterhouse 5, and he tried to get people to join in to this like new thing that he was trying to do, like this new army full of I guess traitors. I don't know what he was thinking, but he was trying to do that. And then they all had to run because the bombing was happening, not the bombing, but a bombing like siren went off, and they all hid for a little while. So that's what happens. And nothing ended up happening that night. But the next night, 130,000 people in Dresden would die, and Billy knows that. So he gets unstuck in time again, and he's back at his house, and his daughter is haranguing him because she found him, like cold and writing, and he disappeared, and he's been causing trouble for his daughter because he's losing his mind. And so he keeps talking to people about the Chalfamidorians or whatever they are. And she blames this guy named Kilgore Trout, who is the author of these science fiction books. She's like, do you know who I could just kill? Kilgore Trout. And he talks about how he actually knows Trout, and because he met him in his hometown of Ilum. He saw him on the side of the street, and he's in charge of like this newspaper boy business, and so he saw him and heard him reference a couple books, and he walked up and said, are you Kilgore Trout? And Trout was like, yeah, how do you know me? And he's like, you write my favorite books. And Trout's like, oh my god, no one knows what my books are. He's like famously terrible at writing. And then Trout comes and becomes involved in his life, and then he talks about how he and his wife had an anniversary party, like an 8-year anniversary party or something, and Trout was invited. And at this anniversary party, 4 men started singing a song, and it had this like super weird effect on Billy. He started to get like basically a panic attack, either that or some type of episode, at the sound of 4 people singing. And not only that, but like the shapes of 4 men just kind of freaked him out. And it's written down that he didn't realize that he had secrets anymore, and he just found a secret from himself that he didn't realize he had. He goes to hide. Trout tries to follow him and ask him questions and ask whether he got unstuck in time, but he hides away, and he tries to get over it, basically. And he gives his wife this nice ring, which is sweet of him. So yeah. Next. And then immediately after this anniversary party, we get the description of the bombing of Dresden. Dresden is bombed at night. Billy knows it's coming. They're all hiding in Slaughterhouse 5. It's some kind of bunker. I believe it's in Slaughterhouse 5. Still a bunker. And they hide there, and they're listening, and someone will go out and check occasionally, and the whole city's just on fire. It's insane. And so they're there for like a full day. They can't come out till noon the next day. And when they do, everything is just, the sky is black with smoke. Like the sun is just like this small pin in the sky, and it looks like the moon, he says. Like there's nothing but minerals, and the stones were hot. Everyone in the neighborhood was dead. So it goes. So that's what he says. Then he said, The guards drew together instinctively, rolled their eyes. They experimented with one expression, then another, said nothing, though their mouths were often open. They looked like a silent film of a barbershop quartet. So that image of the four men singing popped that image into Billy's mind, and he had basically like an episode. My guess that secret he's talking about is that he is not okay with the bombing of Dresden, obviously, because you wouldn't be. The book makes it sound like he would be, because there's like no outward reaction, but clearly something is the matter. That image like haunted him to this day, enough that he had an episodic thing happen at his own anniversary. And he says again, like, it looks like the moon. And he talks how he told Montana about this and their baby at the Tralfamadorian Zoo, because she got pregnant, I guess, and had a baby, and she's still there, which is kind of a bummer. Why did he get to leave and she stayed? That's crazy. I don't know. But she stayed, and she asks him about it, and he tells her about how it looked like a moon, which is really, really kind of a bummer. And then they said that all of their little prisoners of war, like it's 100 of them, Americans, climb out of Slaughterhouse 5 or where they're at, and they kind of crawl across the town, and they find this innkeeper that's still open, kind of on the outskirts. It's not in Dresden because it got bombed, right? But on the outskirts. I think they find this like horse cart, or they walk, something like that. No, this is them walking. Yes. Yep, it's just them walking. They walk, and they get to this innkeeper, and this innkeeper says, "Good night, Americans," lets them stay there. And then it describes how Billy Pilgrim lost his wife in chapter 9. It's super sad, you guys. Essentially, he lost his wife because he was in that airplane crash, and then on the way there, Valencia got in this car wreck, but she was so upset about Billy being hurt because she loved him and, like, cherished him that she kept driving, and then she died right outside his hospital of carbon monoxide poisoning, which is so sad. And then it describes how Billy kind of like was in and out at the hospital. They weren't sure if he would be a vegetable or not from this like airplane crash. And there was a guy in the bed next to him recovering from a broken leg of some kind. I think his name is Richard something, some sort of, like man. I know, that's so helpful. It's like Richard with a P after it. So anyway, whatever. Richard with a P is there, and he's like a professor. And he thinks Billy's like crazy, losing his mind, and he thinks Billy should just be written off. He's like, why doesn't this guy just die already? Which is like super, super not good. It describes how they leave Dresden, how they found this wagon that was attached to 2 horses, and they like climbed in the wagon, and they kind of took stuff, and they like looted essentially some areas, and their old stuff, like they looted themselves, like all the stuff they used to have and stuff like that. And Billy Pilgrim snoozed in this like green coffin that was in the back of the wagon, and it describes it as one of his happiest moments. To be honest, I don't know why. I thought about this moment for a really long time, and I think it's just that this book is a book of juxtapositions, and I'm going to get to that in a little, but this is a book of juxtapositions, and so right after this bombing of Dresden, maybe he had been dreading it because he knew it would happen, and now it was over for him, so he was happy to be done. Or maybe just this simple pleasure of being like in a wagon or something makes him feel better with like stuff around him. It says that he's not really able to feel happy, but if this was the moment, like if he was trying to find a time he was happy, he would choose this moment when he was snoozing in the back of a wagon. So I don't know. It's really interesting. Basically, they keep moving on, and then he falls asleep while people are looting, and this woman and her husband walk up to the horses, and they're cooing to the horses, and he's like, "What are you doing?" And then they kind of ream Billy because the horses, like their bits, like have been dug in, and they're bleeding at the mouths, and their hooves are destroyed, and they're like, "Why would you do this to these horses?" And Billy gets out and weeps at the horses. It's the first time he cries, really, at any sort of like travesty at the war. This reminds me of those times when you're like so stressed that you cry at nothing. Like there was a time I had where I was just like kind of having a bad day, and I got home and there was a bug in my bathroom, and I just like collapsed for like no reason other than there was like a bug in my bathroom. It was not big enough for me to cry about, but I had a bad day. This is what this reminds me of. Like, he clearly is crying about way more than these horses, because he like bursts into tears and sobs. And he said that often after that he would sob quietly and weep quietly sometimes in his life, but he would never make loud boo-hooing noises, which is why the epigraph of this book is the quatrain from the famous Christmas carol. Billy cried very little, though he often saw things worth crying about, and in that respect at least he resembled the Christ of the carol. The cattle are lowing, the baby awakes, but the little Lord Jesus, no crying he makes. So then he traveled back in time, and he's, into Vermont again, where he's in the hospital because, he was in that airplane crash. Sorry, so many crashes. And basically, he tells this man, he's doing research on the war, and he says, I was at the bombing of Dresden. He doesn't believe him. It takes him a while to convince him. And he's at the bomb. He talks about Dresden and how terrible it was, and the guy's like, well, it was necessary. And he's like, yeah, sure. And he kind of agrees, but he's clearly losing his mind. Clearly it's not that way. And then he describes this time when he was in New York and he was going to a bookstore, and he walked into this tawdry, sexy bookstore and looked through, and he found his friend Kilgore's books, and he read a couple and he bought one, and one is very, very similar to his own story. One is about an earthling man and a woman who were kidnapped by extraterrestrials, and they were put to display in a zoo on a planet called Zircon 212. So it's very similar to his own story. Isn't that interesting? And then he also sees some this is a weird sexual store, and he sees this old picture that actually Roland Weary used to have a copy of a woman and a donkey doing something inappropriate, or a horse or a pony or something doing something inappropriate. And so it's kind of full circle with Roland Weary's sad picture. Let's see. Let's talk more. Chapter 8. Chapter 8. Okay. And now, in case you weren't following along, that's fine because I wasn't telling you. We're on chapter 9. And in this chapter, the reason why he's in New York City is because he wants to be on a TV show to talk about his experience of being, kidnapped by the Tralfamadorians. And he goes to this hotel, and he eventually appears on this radio talk show, and they kind of are not talking about him, they're talking about a novel. And then he just jumps in and talks about his alien experience, and they kind of gently usher him out. They're like, why don't you leave, friend? And then we're on to chapter 10, I believe. We also learn in one of these chapters, either chapter 9 or 10, that the way that he dies. He says he dies because he goes to Chicago to do this lecture, and about his experience as an alien guy, and about time, because he's learned that time is not linear. It's everything is existing as it is. And as he's leaving that night, that old guy Lazaro loses his mind and hires someone to kill him, and that's how he dies. And he even tells this to the crowd. He's like, that's how I'll die tonight. Isn't that funny? And they're like, I guess. So that happens. Oh, okay, let's see. Chapter 10. So in chapter 10, the narrator and his old wartime friend go back to Dresden and recount their wartime experiences, and it jumps a little bit more to the narrator's point of view, but he does talk about how when Billy was walking out of Dresden, and he was talking about what they did after Dresden. They started to carry corpses out of holes in the ground and bury them, but then people started dying of basically shock. So they just started kind of setting things on fire in hope that the bodies would burn. Very depressing. And so eventually they, and Edward Derby dies. And it's just one paragraph. It says, somewhere in there, the poor old high school teacher, Edgar Derby, was caught with a teapot he had taken from the catacombs. He was arrested for plundering. He was tried and shot. So it goes. And then he says, this is the last page, and somewhere in there was springtime. The corpse mines were closed down because they were digging for corpses. The soldiers all left to fight the Russians. In the suburbs, the women and children dug rifle pits. Billy and the rest of his group were locked up in the stable in the suburbs. And then one morning, they got up to discover that the door was unlocked. World War II in Europe was over. Billy and the rest wandered out onto the shady street. The trees were leafing out. There was nothing going on out there, no traffic of any kind. There was only one vehicle, an abandoned wagon drawn by 2 horses. The wagon was green and coffin-shaped. Birds were talking. One bird said to Billy Pilgrim, "Poo to wheat." And that's the end of the book. And on to analysis. Okay, I have so many thoughts about this book. Personally, I'll just start with my opinion. So, I thought this book was pretty good. It's definitely not my favorite book in the world. Probably just because I think it's terribly depressing. Now, I like to look up reviews sometimes of books that I feel this way about, that I feel a little misty about, to see if people can like help me land on why I felt that way. And they kind of did. So what happened was a lot of people described this book as being funny, and I really didn't think it was that funny. People were like talking about how they laughed like dark humor at stuff. I just feel bad for Billy. Like maybe it went over my head. I don't know. Maybe I was too focused on like the analysis part of it to like find anything funny, because to me, I don't know. I took that funny bit pretty seriously if you're doing analysis for English, because like maybe he's trying to make a joke, but that's usually where the heavy stuff is. So I don't know. I mean, I can't even really name a moment in here that I thought was slightly funny. Like I don't know. I can't think of one. Maybe the one where he's on the talk show or something, because that's kind of funny. They're like, okay, crazy man, why don't you leave? And that's kind of funny, but like, I'm not even really. So I think part of this book was lost on me because I really didn't think it was that funny. And while it's a short read, it's only like 200 pages, it is very sad. It's maybe one of the sadder books I've maybe ever read, and I've read some sad books because it's just so like heavy, and Billy's such a pitiful, sad, clearly depressed human. So book-wise, it was not my favorite book. I'd probably give it like 3 or 4 stars because it's really well written and it's poignant, but it's not like a book that I love. I don't love it because it was just too heavy for me, I think, emotionally. It was just too much. Like, it took me a while to read it because I was like, woo, need a break. I do think it was entertaining because the Trophimedorians are pretty funny. They're like toilet plungers shaped, and they're like kind of silly. So like, it's all right. Like, it's a little silly, but like, it's just not my favorite book in the world. But I really love doing my analysis of it. So this is a postmodern book. What is postmodern, Jade? You've talked a little about modernism, but what is postmodern? So as a recap, I have it written down here. Modernism was after World War I, and it was like a quest for meaning, and a lot of it was experimental, and it was a lot about like the individual experience, and it usually had stuff like, it was the first to do like unreliable narrators. This includes a couple books we've talked about before and some new ones, like, you know, like what's the one? Why am I blanking on one of the most famous? The Great Gatsby. That's one. You know, stuff like that, like Virginia Woolf, all that, like To the Lighthouse, that's modernism. D.H. Lawrence, it's all modernism. So it's a lot about like, kind of like ambiguity and disillusionment and emotion and identity. Now, postmodernism was after World War II. Basically, all these people were like, okay, so meaning doesn't exist after they saw all these atrocities. And the whole point of postmodern writing was it eschews meaning of any kind. It talked about how life was meaningless, and it talked about disenchantment. It was super fragmented. It did all these crazy experimental stuff. It was about like disorder, and there wasn't any sort of control involved in it. It talked about how like there's really kind of no absolute truth of life. It didn't really garner like deep analysis, and like it was a lot about individual subjective beliefs instead of science and art like modernism was. And it was also playful. So this is like essentially like postmodern literature. This is like playful, fragmented, meaningless, and that is what this book is. I'm not saying it's meaningless for you to read it. I'm saying that for Billy, a lot of things are meaningless, and we're supposed to pity him because of that, I think. But it's also supposed to be an anti-war novel. That's what this novel is described as being. I have some thoughts about that. So let's talk about some of the themes of this novel, because this is very disjointed. It's very fragmented. One of the things I did notice about his writing style is that while you're jumping through time, it's actually not that confusing. And I realized the way that he does it. And he has these really fun things going throughout the novel. He has So It Goes, and he mentions that anytime someone dies. So it feels cohesive because you have that going through the entire thing. It also feels cohesive because while you're jumping through time, there's usually a reason why he jumps to that period in time. So he mentions the train on top of him when he was going to Dresden was black and orange. And then he switches to his daughter's wedding, and he says that like this tent was black and orange. So you see how he jumps from moment to moment. And if you don't, I think that's also important. But you do see it, and so it's well written. Beyond that, the themes of the novel are, I think, it's not really an anti-war novel in my opinion, and I'll get there. it's a lot of, so something I haven't mentioned before is religion. It talks a lot about religion and about Jesus Christ. And actually it compares Billy to Jesus Christ quite a lot, because it says that Christianity, I'm not saying this, by the way, this is what the book says, like explicitly says, that Christianity is like, a lot of people study it to see why it gives people the ability to be so cruel to other people, when Christianity says you shouldn't do that. And they say it's because it was God's son. So the lesson you learn is not actually that you shouldn't kill people, is that you shouldn't kill people with connections. And so what it should be is that Jesus is just this nobody. And then after he's crucified, God says, I'm adopting him as my son. You shouldn't have done that. Don't kill anybody because they might become somebody. Or just that they are somebody. So he talks a lot about religion, and he talks about how he compares himself to Jesus in a lot of different ways. Even in that passage that I read for you, he compares himself to Jesus. Religion is definitely a part of it, which is interesting because he's not super religious, but he seems to think of himself as a Messiah. I mean, his name is Pilgrim. That's his name. And the Pilgrims were voyagers who set out to find a new world. And I think he's trying to create one for himself. So it's kind of sad, but he compares himself to Jesus. It's also about death, war, time, obviously, super obviously time. Death, sex. It's about America. It's about animals. And it's also a book of juxtaposition. So by that, I mean every single thing in this book is such a juxtaposition. If you don't know what juxtaposition is, if you're not well read up on your English, juxtaposition is just putting things next to each other that are completely opposite. So by saying you're happy when you're not happy, or he describes a situation about like something gruesome in a kind of sexual way. And those two things together are awful because they're so juxtaposing. Like, you shouldn't be talking about those two things. One is like considered the epitome of life, and the other is death. So like to juxtapose those things is like jarring. This whole book is full of it. It's full of it. Sentence after sentence is completely opposite. Paragraphs are opposite. His thoughts, like he exits his like prisoner of war train smiling. Everything is wrong, essentially. He does everything wrong. Everything's the wrong reaction. There's no reason. That kind of echoes that meaningless vibe of postmodernism. It's also about creation and destroying things, and how they're so similar. They're two sides of a coin, right? So I think that's where sex comes into this book, because it is kind of a sexualized novel. There's kind of like gross sex things in it. And I think it's because he's emphasizing how similar it is to destruction and how they're just two sides of a coin. And so he puts them together a lot because they're juxtaposing. So really interesting. I think the time bit about him not having control over time and time being like 4D and it all at once, and it just is all about how he has no power. I think, to back this up a little bit, I think that Billy, this is your choice because it's a book and it is science fiction, so you could see it as true that he was abducted by aliens. I think it has a little bit of a deeper meaning. Not quite, it's still deep with the science fiction, but I think it's interesting if you look at it from him having PTSD. If you consider him having PTSD, you can consider these moments through time as flashbacks. I mean, you can't really explain the future stuff that he knows, but you can kind of explain him as just losing his mind. But you can explain it as kind of PTSD. And in that PTSD, we get a lot of like his shock and opinion and all that powerlessness that he feels. I think he transfers that to time. I mean, PTSD is known for flashbacks, so it would make sense to me that he's experiencing PTSD and he's making sense of it through these novels that he's read from Trout that very closely follow his own timeline. And, that's how he's making sense of his life right now, because it doesn't make any sense to him. And because if he sees it that way, he kind of gives himself a little bit of control in the situation to not care about it, because otherwise he's just powerless against it. I also think time is a comfort mechanism, because you can look at it as, it is not lost on me that this book is full of dead people, and every time someone dies, he says, oh, it's okay. Like, they're not dead. Like, that is such a strong comfort mechanism. It doesn't surprise me that his obsession with time also means that no one is ever truly dead. I think that it's very comforting, and I think it's something that a crazy man would come to after seeing a lot of death. He could say, oh, it's okay, because time is not linear, and therefore they're not dead, and it's not something to be sad about, and it's not something that I should lose my mind over, and it's fine. So time really seems like a comfort mechanism to me. There's the futility of free will, which is kind of a bummer, but that's what he's also feeling in this like time and all these things. He's saying, I can't do anything about it. Like fate is fate. Like, everything is, and it will be, and it'll always be, and I can't do anything about it. It implies that there is no free will whatsoever, which, is sad, and you can take from that what you will, but that is what Billy is feeling. There's also growing old. There's his mom in a mental hospital, not mental, in like an old person's home. And throughout the book, we get people who ask, how did I get so old? And in this book, I know we get to Billy's death, but really it's a very short little passage. A lot of it, even though it's not linear, is Billy getting older. And he's always kind of crazy. He weeps, he falls asleep in the middle of sentences, he's not all there, but he is there enough to know that he's getting older. So it's not surprising to me that he thinks a lot about getting older and the experiences he's had with other people who get older. So let's talk about what I think this book is essentially. So people say this is an anti-war book. I think this is an anti-death book. This is an anti-death book. What do I mean by that? What do I mean anti-war, anti-death? What are you talking about? What does it matter? Okay, here is the key for the book for me. Very, very important. So in postmodern and modern literature, what I learned was that literally, usually, the important part of a book is what is not mentioned or what is glossed over. Because those are the moments in the book that your character who's talking to you, this unreliable narrator, feels they can't describe. And there's usually a reason why they can't describe it. Maybe it's too personal or it affected them too harshly. It's why every time someone dies, he says, so it goes. He glosses over it. He keeps moving on. He implies that they're still, he implies that they're still going. Like, it's fine. That doesn't affect me at all. And I think it really, really does. So I think it really, really does. So I think this book is an anti-death book for this one reason, okay? I looked up information about this book before I did our podcast because I like to know things about books. And every single thing I read said that he started getting unstuck in time after he was abducted by the Tralfamadorians. That is wrong. That is not correct. That is not the first time he becomes unstuck in time. The first time he becomes unstuck in time is in the war, and he's not abducted by the Tralfamadorians or whatever their name is until like after the war at his daughter's wedding. He is not abducted for like a long time. And people are like, oh, it's from that he thinks he's unstuck in time. I disagree. Here's why. I felt very smart about this. I'm very excited. Okay, here's why. Because I think the PTSD he has in this novel, it involves the war, yes. But I think the bit of this novel that is the key of the entire thing is his father's funeral. I think that's the key to this whole book, okay? Because this book starts off with Billy being born, and then he goes through life and he goes through the Grand Canyon. It talks about his father dumping him into the deep end of the pool and his father rescuing him. I think he's always had problems, but then he goes to school and his father dies. His father dies and he goes to his father's funeral, and like days after he's sent to the war, he's still wearing the shoes that he wore to his father's funeral. And then in the war, after his first battle, he starts to become unstuck in time. So several things can happen here. Obviously, I think the war is a huge part of it because what he is remembering is the war, right? Like that's important. But I think a big, big part of it is his father. And he even kind of mentioned this in the book, but he throws it away. He says that in the veteran hospital, they don't think the war is the matter with him. They're convinced that it's because his dad threw him into the deep end of a pool. I don't think that's why, but I do think his dad dying is a huge reason why he starts to become obsessed with time and why he thinks that you can't die. Essentially, that's what this book says. You can't die. You can't die because you either have a son or a daughter, or because, that's me extrapolating, or because, according to Billy, time is always happening, always happening. It is, and it will repeat, and it's cyclical. You can jump through time anytime you want, and it's not existent. They're always going to be around. It doesn't shock me that he becomes obsessed with anti-death, essentially, immediately following his father's funeral. I also think it's really important because he mentions it a lot, and through all of his time being unstuck in this whole novel, he never talks about it. I was waiting for the moment he described his father's funeral because it's very, like present in almost the whole book. He mentions his father's funeral, he mentions his father being dead, he comes across people whose fathers are dead. It's a big thing. And every time, he never mentions it. It makes me think it's very important. It makes me think it's the thing that he can't think about and the thing that really drove him crazy. Like, it's not the thing because the war, I think, added on to it. Fun facts. So I was a psychology minor, and we learned in one of my classes that part of the reason why, theorized, that we become mentally ill is because we all have a genetic line, and when our stress passes that line, it's possible for us to develop a mental illness. So it's about genetics combined with like stress and how we handle stress. So if you want to think of it that way, you don't have to. That's just what's theorized in my psychology class. It's called the stress diathesis model, if anyone is interested. If you are interested in that, I think this book, basically Billy, I think, was already at a very high stress point from his father's funeral. I think that was his first check, right? Like that was his first straw on the camel's back. It didn't quite break it, but it was the first straw. And then he was in that battle where his whole regiment got destroyed, and it was too much. I think that's the point. He lost his mind. He crossed past that genetic line, and he developed craziness, and he started getting unstuck in time, and he had PTSD, and he was flying all around time as he perceived it. And even another theory I had was that he actually dies, and this is just kind of like a dream, Do you ever, I don't know, a couple times I theorized that maybe he just died in some of these events, and this is what he, either that or he entered a coma, and this is how he thinks about time, because then he can manipulate it. And he can manipulate what happens. It would make sense for how he sees the future if he is in charge of his own world, right? It makes sense if he's, dead / in a coma or whatever. So I theorized that too. I think that's less likely. That's just a fun thought I had while I was reading. But yeah, so by my approximations and my analysis, I claim this to be an anti-war book. He is very saying that war is meaningless. He says that war is inevitable. But I think the point of it is that while it might be inevitable, it's important to call war what it is, which is senseless slaughter. And it's not anything that has meaning, or it's not anything that should be glorified. Like when it was World War II, it was the Children's Crusade, and children were just fighting in that war. And it was not anything that should have happened. So it's less about him wanting to make change, because postmodern is all about how that's meaningless, and more about him just saying, here's what it was. People have it wrong. Here's what it was. It simply is, so it goes. Other themes in this book, the only other thing I noticed that I thought was kind of cute that I haven't seen anyone notice is that there are a couple of animals that recur and recur and recur. And so while this book is about anti-death, it's about war, it's about the cruelty of man, it's about science and science fiction and PTSD and believing in your personal beliefs, because that's what he does. I think also there was a couple motifs that I noticed that I really liked. One of them is freedom and death. And I liked this, and this is just my little analysis. So this is me personally. This is not whatever. But I noticed this thing and I thought it was cool. Essentially, there are these things where birds are around a lot, and there are also dogs around a lot. And I noticed at these moments that the birds and dogs were around. So at the very end of the book, it ends with po tweet tweet, and it's a question. And so I think it's supposed to be a meaningless question that you can't answer. It's supposed to be kind of sad, but I also think it's important that it was a bird that asked the question, because in my experience reading this book, every time a bird is brought up, it's kind of synonymous with freedom. So a bird tweets at the very end, right when the war is over. I think that's important. In the prisoner of war camp, a British guy talks about how he's been there for 5 years. He hasn't seen a woman, he hasn't seen a girl, he hasn't seen a bird. He says a bird specifically. A couple other times you hear a po tweet tweet, and it's usually like I said, synonymous with a freeing moment or freedom of some kind. And dogs, on the other hand, every time a dog barks, it echoes, and it's usually something bad. The dog is a bit more shady for me, but for example, a dog barks when he's found being beaten up by WWII. And then a dog barks again whenever he's being, brought up into the alien ship. And so animals have this whole thing where I think Billy actually really gets along with animals and finds meaning in animals more so than the humans around him, is what I'm trying to say. I think he sees birds as synonymous with freedom, and maybe dogs are less as death or something bad, but maybe they're him being rescued by something, because that's usually when that happens. He was rescued by the aliens in a way, because he ends up being kind of happier with the aliens than he does in his hometown. He says it's the same, but he still dreams of Monica, and he seems like kind of happier there, and he's more honest with her than he is with his wife Valencia and stuff like that. And so maybe the dog barking is like a sign of change, or him being rescued, which he says he hates, but it ends up happening to him a lot. This book is so heavy, and there's so much analysis, and there's so much I could talk about, but that gives you a basic rundown of what I thought about it, which was that it wasn't my favorite book ever, but I really enjoyed not tearing it apart, but analyzing it and really looking in meaning for it about like freedom and death and like the inevitability of war and like human nature, like all these things. It's a lot about like society and like trying to point out stuff that maybe we don't pay attention to or think incorrectly about. I think it's a short little book. I think it's a good read. I don't recommend it if you're sad about anything. I don't recommend it on a vacation. I think it would bring you down. But if you're looking for a small book, if you maybe want to feel intellectual, or if you want to test out your English comprehension, I think this is a good book for it because it's simple prose, it's short, and it's meaningful. So I think it's a good intro to modernism and postmodernism. I think you could get the habit of it. And so, yeah. Like I said, I give it like 3 or 4 stars out of 5. Like, it was pretty good. It's not my favorite book ever, but it was very fun for me to pick apart for you. Thank you so much, Bad Book Club friends, for sticking around. I really appreciate you, listening to my little summary and my my little analysis, disjointed as it was. Anyway, if you want to support Bad Book Club, you can follow us on our social media at Bad Book Club Pod. I'm on Instagram and TikTok and Twitter, even though I never post on Twitter, but you can follow me there. And we also have a Patreon. For less than a cup of coffee a month, you can keep the podcast going. It is created by me, myself, and I. I read the books, I do all the analysis, I do the recording and editing, and your support means the most to me. I try to put little things on Patreon to make up for it, and I appreciate all of you so much for sticking with me in Patreon. I really, really appreciate it. If you leave a review, I could give you a shout out in the next episode, which I really appreciate. And thank you guys so much. If you could recommend us to a friend, I'd appreciate it. Thanks for joining in on Bad Book Club. I'll see you next time, and have a great week, friends. Bye. Wait, I forgot to say, bye, lovelies. It's always lovelies. Goodbye.